Good morning. Good morning to you all participants. Thank you very much, Beatrice, for introducing this conversation. Good morning to the participants in Europe. Good evening to those of you that are joining from the Pacific, including our panelists. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this Project Lab discussion organized to explore the topic of climate change and mobility at the European Development Days. During this session, we will explore what a changing climate means for human mobility in the Pacific. As we all know, climate change and disasters lead to forced mobility of millions of people. And the Pacific is impacted like no other. The Pacific is, as we know, the continent with the least contribution to climate change, and at the same time, it is the continent that is the most impacted by climate change. So let's see what it means in terms of forced mobility. My name is Erwan Martey. I work in the European Commission DG for International Partnerships, known as INPA. It's the former DEFCO, and I am the team leader for forced displacement, migration, and development. The discussion has been prepared by the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC. We will draw on personal experiences, emerging evidence, ongoing efforts by national governments, regional forums, international partners, such as IOM and IDMC, and of course the EU. In this context, I'm sad to mention the passing a few days ago of the former IOM Director General, Mr. Swing, who was a remarkable leader for his organization and a man of vision that has understood the importance of climate and environmental displacement and migration, and notably in the Pacific. So our condolences to our IOM colleagues. We will have today three very interesting panelists that you can already, I think, see on your screen, that are kind enough to join us despite the time difference with the Pacific, because it's already the night for them. Tia Tira, Mrs. Tia Tira, Mr. Mafua MAKA, and Mr. Nathaniel Spate. Let me introduce them already now. Ms. Tira is currently working at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, the PIFS, as the PACRES project coordinator. PACRES project stands for Pacific Adaptation to Climate Change and Resilience Building. Prior to this role, she worked for the government of the Republic of Kiribati. She also served as an advisor at the IMF Executives Director's Office representing Kiribati, among other notable functions. Mr. MAKA is the director of the Kingdom of Tonga's National Emergency Management Office, or NEMO, which sits under the Ministry of Meteorology, Energy, Information, Disaster Management, Environment, Climate Change, and Communication. As a Tongan national, Mr. MAKA initially joined NEMO as a community awareness and training officer. He has an extensive experience in conducting community disaster risk management and disaster awareness programs throughout Tonga's communities, especially in the outer islands. Indeed, a very interesting experience he will share with us. Finally, Nathaniel Spate is the project manager at the IDMC programs team, focusing on climate and disaster-induced displacement in the Pacific. Prior to this role, he was working with United Nations Development Programme Pacific Office on designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating environmental climate change, adaptation, and risk governance projects in over 10 countries in the Pacific. There as well, like the other two panelists, a very concrete experience of the situation in that very large continent. Natha has also worked as an advisor to the chief negotiator when Fiji was presiding over the UN Climate Conference in 2017-18, and he spent also a short stint with the British High Commission in Fiji to particularly strengthen the regional engagement in the Pacific. Here are our guests. I cannot see Tia on the screen. I don't know, Tia, can you? Unfortunately, she was with us initially. I'm sure she will join. So, as many of us are aware, climate change is, of course, influencing human mobility globally, and, as I said earlier, in the Pacific. We have all heard at least of some anecdotes or seen some documentaries on the effect of sea rising, on the multiplication of disasters in various regions of the world, and certainly in the Pacific. So it's very important, more important than ever, to take stock of what we know and also of what we can do, because we can do things. It's not just a fatality that is upon us and we cannot do anything. We can change, we can adapt to this. And we need these realities of today to be fully integrated in our approach to development work. And I can really tell you that for my Directorate General in charge of international partnerships, of development cooperation policy, it is really very important. I think the best now is maybe that we start before delving into the discussion to go virtually to the Pacific with a short video, particularly to the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which is a country in the Pacific that is consisting of 5 islands and 29 coral atolls. Carlon, a local resident and student, will share some thought-provoking words with us. It will help us to get started. So this clip is part of a video that was developed under the EU-funded IOM project that I mentioned before, that I have not actually mentioned before, because indeed this, something I forgot to mention is that this program that we are having today is also in the context of several actions that are implemented in the region with IOM and with IDMC. So one of these programs is the IOM project. It is in this context that we will see this video. If we can have a look. Thank you.
Wiyam lamanak ilan marang chamala arwa chugu mamanak yon ailen kenar kajni nar chola chinchiburim chumar manaj perwodino ailen kenar wiyam lamanak. Scientists say we have until 2030 before it floods, because we're only 2 meters above water. That 2 meters is cultures, 2 meters of language, 2 meters of legends, myths. There's a seawall made of cars. It's actually sad looking.
So, is it not breathtaking what Carlon is telling us? I think we see the urgency. We are in 2021 and we have 9 years before all this gets flooded. It's what Carlon tells us. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what the panelists will be capable to tell us about the concrete experience and insight that they have. And I will be happy also that the participants to this project lab discussion also share views and experiences with us. If you have any questions for the panelists as they speak, please write them down, and you can copy and paste them into the interactive Slido that you will see once we get to the Q&A segment that is coming in a bit after the first part of our discussion. I would like to turn to the panelists. I would like to ask maybe to the technicians whether Tia Tira has managed to join us. Tia, are you? Tia is not here. Ah, that is sad. Let me then ask. I wanted to ask Tia the first question, so I will ask therefore rather to Mafua MAKA to tell us a little bit about his experience. Zooming on the aspect of disaster displacement in particular, Mafua, based on your experiences, what are the key challenges that countries such as the Kingdom of Tonga face in managing displacement caused by climate-related disasters? How do you see that?
Malo abito Mr. Ewan Mateo, European Commission Director General for International Partnerships, International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the International Displacement Monitoring Center, ITMC, and my fellow panelists, Tia Tira and Nathaniel Spade. As some of you are aware, the Kingdom of Tonga is located in the South Pacific and is comprised of 172 islands that are all acutely vulnerable to natural disasters and adverse impact of climate change. Tonga has already had experience dealing with disaster displacement due to a volcanic eruption that occurred in 1946 in the kingdom's most northern island in Mafua. That resulted in the affected population displaced and relocated to the island of Ewa in the south to rebuild their community. While the relocation was successful, as global temperatures increased with climate change, it is predicted that cyclones, coastal flooding, storm surges, and sea level rise pose greater risks in the future due to the increased intensity and frequency, and this will put our coastal and island communities at further risk of losing their homes and becoming displaced. Since 1960, Tonga has been impacted by 76 tropical cyclones. Extreme weather events, such as cyclones, often trigger mass displacement, cause widespread destruction to infrastructure and production systems, and disrupt access to basic services such as education, and over time places an increased level of stress on our communities, which can lead them to consider migration. To compound the complexity of this issue, there is the lack of accurate and reliable data and information specific to disaster displacement that is available to Pacific Islands governments. It is imperative to share any data and information that is available to be able to assist with better coordinated planning. With rapid onset disasters, it is more challenging to be able to predict and plan in a comprehensive supportive manner, which then exacerbates the challenge in supporting humanitarian response and recovery efforts with effective, sustainable solutions. The challenge of mitigating, preparing for, and responding to disaster displacement is at the forefront of my mind, and I believe the challenges of climate change, displacement, and forced migration are shared by all nations in the South Pacific.
Thank you very much, Mafua. Thank you for sharing this. It is quite an impressive picture that you have described of the situation. I have to say, the many challenges that your country is facing. I think that our first panelist, Tia, is back. Yes, I see her on the screen. Tia, very happy to have you. For all the participants, you know, these are the consequences of a virtual event, particularly when it is connected over thousands and thousands of kilometers. Tia, I would like to ask you a question. I understand that the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat and other regional partners are trying to enhance regional cooperation and coordination. Can you please explain why this is important? And can you give us some examples of the practices that are supporting this cooperation?
Thank you, Ewan, and apologies. The marvels of internet connection, particularly from this region. But thank you, and also thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. I hope I'm coming in loud and clear. But in response to your question, the Pacific region is very cognizant of the value of working as a collective with the framework for Pacific regionalism underpinning the region's collective action, recognizing the advantages of shared purpose and of close cooperation and coordination. This is further manifested in the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, which provides a long-term vision and a collective commitment to secure the future of the Blue Pacific. In the context of climate mobility, the regional frameworks that guide regional collaboration and coordination include the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, more commonly known as the FRDP, and the Boya Declaration Action Plan. The FRDP reiterates the need to protect individuals and communities most vulnerable to climate change impacts, including displacement and migration, through targeted national and regional policies, even by examining opportunities provided by regional labor migration schemes. And the Boya Declaration Action Plan expands the region's concept of security, including prioritizing human security and humanitarian assistance, acknowledging that climate change threatens human security, including through climate mobility. For the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, the Pacific Resilience Partnership is established as a complementary mechanism for its effective implementation, and it's an inclusive multi-stakeholder partnership. It reflects and recognizes that in the Pacific, climate change and disaster risk cannot be addressed in isolation of development aspirations, including the need for a multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach to managing risk and securing our development ambitions. In the context of climate mobility, it is about managing the risk and addressing the issue in a holistic manner. Within this regional mechanism, the Technical Working Group on Human Mobility was established with the key objectives of enhancing coordination of related initiatives and voluntary actions related to migration, displacement, and planned relocation. It serves as a regional expert platform for networking and representation with the capacity to support governments on specific issues. It promotes and strengthens efforts to address climate change and disaster-driven migration, displacement, and planned relocation. It's currently chaired by IOM, and its membership includes the UN agencies, civil society, governments, regional agencies, academia, and youth. Recently this year, it convened the Pacific Regional Consultation on Internal Displacement in collaboration with the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. And it provided a platform for national governments to dialogue and share their perspectives on issues of internal displacement with a global mechanism that is tasked with finding solutions to the global internal displacement crisis. It was a practical and tangible example of regional collaboration, and in this particular case, serving as a regional expert platform with the capacity to support governments and elevate their voice on specific issues, particularly around climate mobility. Thank you, Evan, and hope that clarify some of the questions raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tia. I think it's very interesting. It's good that action is made collectively and that there is mobilization to address these challenges. I will turn now to Nadia, recognizing the challenges and also this collective response. Can you provide some additional initiatives that are taking place to mitigate and address the challenges?
Absolutely, Owen. I'd like to acknowledge the fellow panelists this morning, and also to thank you and INPA for enabling IDMC and its partners to provide this needed support in the Pacific. So in response to your question, I'd like to just highlight some of the work done to date by the Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement, or PRDD project. So by way of background, this INPA-funded IDMC initiative in the Pacific is implemented in partnership with the International Organization for Migration and the Platform for Disaster Displacement to assist the government of Fiji, the Marshall Islands, Tonga, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu to address and plug in the gaps, the evidence and knowledge gaps, the policy and capacity gap that are necessary to mitigate or address the risks and impacts of disaster displacement. So some of the work that the project is doing includes the development of country displacement risk profiles. This is a very important tool that that kickstart the work on plugging in the evidence and knowledge challenges that Mafua has already highlighted. The county displacement risk profile that IDMC has developed and working with national disaster management authorities provides some preliminary baseline assessment of disaster displacement, historical trends, drivers, and future risks based on publicly available information, and using also some of the risk modeling tools. And then the second thing is we are noticing that in the Pacific, a lot of this displacement, a lot of climate and disaster risks are centered or concentrated within urban centers. However, there's very little understanding to understand better on how displacement happens within the urban settings. Therefore, the project has been supporting has published rather an analytical or assessment framework to help actors to better understand disaster displacement within urban settings. And this tool is currently being rolled out in town centers in Vanuatu, in Port Vila, and also in Batown here in Fiji, with the ultimate aim to develop case studies, but also inform the municipality plans, development plans and policies, and their respective DRR actions and interventions. On the policy gap, the project is working very closely with the disaster management authorities at national level to integrate the needs and concern of internal displaced people into existing policies, plans, laws, mechanisms, and processes. The use of the Words into Action tool that most of you listening in today might have been aware of provides the guidance not only partners such as PRDD, the Platform for Disaster Displacement, and IOM, but also government on how to integrate and consider disaster and climate-related displacement into the existing policy processes. The second thing that the project have done is also to map out legal policies and legal mechanisms that are already there in the Pacific to then inform a regional policy discussion that Tia has already alluded to, and that is something that the project is supporting mostly government and regional organization in further understanding the legal mechanism that are already there that provides and outlines the different mobility pathways for the internally displaced people in the context of climate change and disasters. The last thing that the project is trying to address is the capacity gap. More importantly, the collection of disaster displacement data and evidence at the moment are happening at very different intervals, and also mostly focusing on just the response period, and most of the data are analyzed at national level. There's no standard that is available, and this is where the project is coming in to support the region, but also the 5 governments that I've mentioned initially, to develop a standard operating procedures that is accompanied by training modules that outline the collection and outline the way of collecting and analyzing and storing disaster displacement data that are fit for purpose, so that it informs the different policy processes that are already there within government. And I have to say, Ewan, that this is not only the only initiative that are present in the region, and there are also other ones that are implemented by the other organizations such as GIZ and other IOM initiatives as well. And the regional collaboration that Tia has alluded to has really been a critical element in terms of advancing work to support government in this Pacific Island region to address the issue of disaster displacement risks and impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natha. I think it was very interesting what you told us. I note 2 points among the many things that you have said. One is the urban dimension. that has really to be well factored in, and that implies indeed to work with the local authorities as well. And the other aspect is the question of data, something we need to have a good understanding, a good knowledge about this. I will turn back to Tia again. Tia, precisely following up on what Naja was just saying. I mean, how important are the development of regional policies and practices how are they important for supporting the countries of the Pacific Islands in adapting its responding to the climate change and its impacts? Can you enlighten us a little bit on this?
Yes, thank you, Owen. And as Natha has highlighted, the regional policies and practices are quite important as they provide a means for collective action that assist in overcoming geographical and demographic disadvantages. And particularly with most of our Pacific Island countries, they're characterized by small public administrations and institutional and capacity constraints. In the context of human mobility, particularly in the context of increasing climate and disaster risks, it's quite a complex issue in the Pacific. And resolving these complex situations is quite challenging and protracted. The challenge is further compounded if the issue poses significant sensitivities, which are not allowing for informed and proper planning and management that can potentially mitigate the devastating impact of climate-related and disaster-induced human mobility. Despite the sensitivities surrounding this issue, the FRDP and PRP, and particularly the partnership that make up the PRP, including NATHA's initiative, PDD, IOM, they will continue to elevate the discussions on the human and social implications of climate change impacts with the objective of exploring options and utilizing the existing mechanisms such as the Technical Working Group on Human Mobility and working hand in hand with partners. For the Technical Working Group on Human Mobility, it is currently progressing research briefs that add further to the knowledge base on this issue and where possible assist governments to make informed decisions and policies. The Swiss government, through the project that I'm currently managing, the EU PACRIS project, has provided resources to support this work. At the same time, the Technical Working Group on Human Mobility also provides a space for coordination of activities, including regional programs in the field of disaster displacement and climate mobility, the ones that are led by the Technical Working Group members. And it enables the exchange of practices, discussion of regional policies and joint approaches. Currently, there are discussions around a regional framework and climate mobility, but it also enables and supports Pacific inputs to the global policy discussions. And this is what I mentioned earlier about the Pacific Regional Consultation on Internal Displacement. In terms of the Boe Declaration, with leaders through the Boe Declaration elevating the issue of climate change as a security issue, it places increased emphasis on the urgency of addressing climate change from a human security perspective. This provides a basis for countries to seek resources and assistance that doesn't just respond and react to the impacts of climate change, but preferably goes to the core causes of climate change and in the process, prevent adverse impacts of climate mobility. Thank you, Erwin.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you very much. In the light of also the time that is unfortunately always too short, may I ask Mafua also to tell us what are the priorities of Tonga in preparing for and responding to disaster displacement? If you could be a bit brief, Mafua, excuse me for that.
Thank you, Erwin. The government of the Kingdom of Tonga, along with our fellow Pacific countries of Fiji, Mafua Islands, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, will work together to progress the Pacific's regional response to reduce the risk and impact of those at risk of disaster-related displacement. With the generous support of the International Organization for Migration, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and the Platform for Disaster Displacement. The European Union-funded Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement project is an excellent example of how we are collaborating with our partners in addressing these challenges. The government of Tonga has recently launched a migration and sustainable development policy that covers disaster displacement through the themed focus on building resilience against climate-induced risks and natural disaster. The government of Tonga, through the Disaster Management Office, is working closely with IOM to develop the tool Displacement Tracking Metric System, the TTM, with the aims to collect data specifically on disaster displacement persons and their needs, which will assist in developing Tonga's disaster displacement risk profile and develop disaster displacement risk models. These data will assist the Statistics Department in terms of collecting human mobility data in the coming years. The National Emergency Management Office, NEMO, has completed the review of Tonga's Emergency Management Act 2007 with extensive public consultation and is now due to be tabled in Parliament in June. This has provided an opportunity for disaster displacement to be recognized and integrated, which will continue into related disaster management policies and plans. I'm very appreciative of IOM, IDMC, and PTT's joint submission on our emergency management legislative reform. Tonga's cluster system is now formally included in the new disaster management legislation, as well as the additional cluster on disaster displaced affected people and evacuation center, which includes those temporarily displaced. NEMO welcomes further support from IOM in Tonga, particularly with the at-risk of long-term to permanent disaster displaced communities, as the evacuation centers are where the affected persons, families, and communities are encouraged to go to for safety. I'm also looking forward to seeing how the specific guidance and tools coming from IOM's EU-funded mainstreaming migration into international cooperation and development, the MMICD project, could be useful in mainstreaming migration and displacement into broader environment and climate change programs, plans, and policies. The government of Tonga will continue to work closely with our key stakeholders, including within the ministries, to minimize future risk and build resilience of Tongan communities, including those at risk of long-term displacement as a result of the impacts of hazard and or climate change. Through Tonga's Strategic Development Framework 2, the government of Tonga has identified the need to build resilience and will continue to work towards this for a more resilient Tonga. I would like to end by saying malo opito. Thank you very much to the European Union for providing support to Tonga through this effective partnership that you have fostered. It is with your support that we will achieve our aspirations as a people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mafua. I'm very happy to hear that the projects that we are funding with our partners are meeting your needs on getting your satisfactions. It's very positive. Naja, I'm sure you heard the compliments that were made for your project, so well done. But could you, again, very shortly, because we don't have much time, Naja, tell us one or two lessons learned or experience in the Pacific that you think could be replicated or could be applied to other regions of the world?
Yeah. Thank you, Erwin. I think it's quite clear from my fellow panelists about the need for regional collaboration to address such complex issue. And the regional collaboration that is facilitated by well-established, well-supported, multi-stakeholder regional coordinating mechanism with associated regional policy frameworks that guides the work of such mechanism. We at IDMC are finding that very valuable, and I'm sure other countries, other region will definitely find value in working in that manner. Secondly, the need to move away from a sectoral approach of addressing the issue of disaster and climate-related displacement, and focusing more into integration. The issue of disaster displacement is emerging at a time when there's a lot of competing development priorities. SDG, there's about 17 goals. And in the smart way and to deal with this issue at national, subnational, even at regional level, is to really integrate it into existing policy processes, mechanisms, and different laws and policies that do exist already within countries. Those are the two main lessons learned, Ewan, that I definitely think that that countries and other regions of the world can find value in addressing this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Najat. That's very interesting indeed. Let's move quickly now to the Q&A session. And ask you, the audience, to put forward some questions that you would like for the panelists to answer. I hope we can see now on Slido, yes, it is appearing. So there is a question from Anonymous, which is, what impact is the increasing occurrence of natural disaster having on the long-term viability of remote islands communities? Maybe I would like to ask that to Mafua. Would you like to take this question? Mafua, can you hear me? Can you read the question? Is the question of the viability of remote island communities? Based on your practice. Or would another of the panelists want to take the question? I don't know, Tia, maybe, do you want to take the question?
Hi, Ewan. Yes, I don't mind taking the question until Mafua comes online. I think we shouldn't underestimate the resilience of our island communities. They've been living in the islands for quite a long time. They've managed to survive harsh conditions. They've managed to survive, the general demographic challenges that they live in. But to a certain degree, I think there's a lot of impacts that of not their own making. And I think this is the issue that needs to be addressed, how these impacts the underlying causes, particularly climate change, how the global community as a whole should come together and ensure that these island communities are not adversely impacted. But I think we can learn a lot also from their traditional and cultural practices that has made them quite resilient for a long, long time in terms of where they've been and how they've survived through the harsh conditions that remote communities usually face. Thank you, Ewan, and I think Mafua has come online, but thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Tia. Mafua, do you want to add to what Tia said? I'm not sure Mafua is. Yes, please, Mafua. I think we have a small communication issue because I see Mafua speaking, but I cannot hear him. Yes, clearly. Let me turn then maybe to ask Najat. Can you tell us, Nathan, how you see this question? I mean, of the viability of communities.
The impact varies from countries to countries, and I have to acknowledge that the different countries do face different level of impacts depending on where they're situated and the geographical makeup as well, and then impacts also ranges from food security issues, water security issues, and other humanitarian need that needs to also be addressed. So one of the key things that we are finding out already that while the impacts, it's not. The challenge here is it's not really understood quite well, and this is due to issues concerning the where is it being fed up into? What is the feedback mechanism from communities to ensure that those who have the resources to respond to are well informed? And this is where we are coming into to really ensure that these issues are made known and unpacked, and so we are be able to respond adequately to it. As Tia mentioned, it's while there is we're in the climate crisis, and but then we also have to acknowledge that they've been adopting adaptive mechanism already and coping mechanisms that are already in place. We shouldn't discount that, and that we need to also marry that with the approaches that we use to respond to all these measures. So it's not doomsday yet for most of the Pacific Island countries, and it's about the approach and ensuring that all these impacts are being fed up and being made known.
Thank you very much, Natha. Do we have time for another question? I hear there is another question that we should see on the Slido. Yes. So what more can be done to support build resilience in the Pacific? Big question for the three experienced practitioners that you are. One sentence each of you. I start with Tia, then Mafua, then Nadja.
Yeah, thank you, Erwin. I think what can be done more from the context of what we're working on at the moment. A lot more can be done if the whole global community comes together to support and ensure that climate change impacts are not creating more problems in the region, particularly the Pacific region. But I also think the region has a lot to share with the rest of the world, as Natha has highlighted. I'm sure that our efforts are enabling us to survive the current impacts. Thank you, Erwin.
Thank you very much. You are very right. And I think in the context of the platform for disaster displacement in Geneva, what is done in the Pacific matters a lot. And we are supporting that as the EU as well. Mafua, do you want to say one sentence of something that can be done to build resilience?
Yeah, thank you, Erwin. It highlights the need for more data and information. As previously mentioned, we are resilient as the data will assist with recovery efforts and communities planning efforts. So the work through TTM will assist with tracking hazard and potential displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mafua. Natha, one sentence, what more?
We need to start investing more in dedicated government capacity. This is paramount, and because the issue of disaster displacement, climate-related displacement, needs constant and regular monitoring, and having dedicated capacity within government will allow that to happen, and also ensuring that there is convening multi-sectoral stakeholders together.
Thank you so much, Natha. I think we need to wrap up and close this session. I found it very interesting. It could have lasted certainly, no problem, 1 hour more of this excellent exchange. I'm very happy that we had voices from the Pacific to tell us about this situation. So a big thank to the panelists for their excellent contribution. Thank you for the very good questions that were asked as well. And on this, I thank everybody for participating. Thank you very much, and wishing you in the Pacific a good night because it's very late for you. Thank you that you made the extra effort to join us today. Thank you.